Did James Baldwin escape the horrors of America by leaving it? That's the question. In 1948, at just 24 years old, Baldwin left Harlem for Paris with $40 in his pocket, and the weight of racism, poverty, and so much more on his shoulders. He wasn't just chasing life, he was running from death, his own, his father's, and the slow death of being a black queer man in a country that refused to see his full humanity. But exile didn't mean escape. It meant reflection. It meant witnessing America from afar, its beauty, its brutality, and returning again and again. This is the story of James Baldwin's journey between nations, between identities, between hope and despair, and maybe, just maybe, it's a story about how no black artist truly escapes America. Found lately when I've been researching a lot for this new essay collection that I'm working on at this residency, I find myself thinking about and returning to James Baldwin again and again. There are so many things about James Baldwin's lifetime and work that still reaches people today, whether it be the incisiveness of his creative nonfiction, the yearning and the processing and the loneliness and the abandonment throughout so much of his fiction, or his versatility as a writer, his ability to use words to push people to learn things they wouldn't otherwise necessarily need to learn. And to give you a basic rundown, James Baldwin was born in New York City in 1924. He grew up to two poor parents. Notably, his stepfather was a preacher that pushed James Baldwin into being in the church as he got older. And as the oldest of his number of siblings, James Baldwin felt a lot of responsibility growing up. And he grew up with the northern racism of New York City, of segregation, of the ways that people treated you when you walked through certain neighborhoods where it was whites only. He talked a lot in his younger years about how his father was kind of eaten alive by the treachery of Americanized racism. And this eventually, all of these things when he was younger, led James Baldwin to eventually start writing when he was a teenager, to distance himself from the church a little bit, and to really become obsessed with the power of words outside of the religious kind of setting. But without further ado, let's get into why James Baldwin still scares America today, and did he ever really escape?
James Baldwin agreed to make a film about his life as a writer rather than as a political figure. Paris seemed an obvious location, as it was here that his career as a successful writer began.
Paris.
Right.
I'm not in the least interested in my 22 years in this city. It's of no importance at all.
Right.
What is important is I'm a survivor of something and a witness to something. That is what matters.
Right.
And that is all that matters. I'm not speaking for me. I'm much too proud, for one thing, to speak for my own work. My work will speak for itself or it won't.
In the years preceding Baldwin going to Paris in 1948, a lot of really trying things happened in his life. He would graduate high school, and then right after high school, he would attempt to distance himself from his family because he wanted to take a break from preaching. He wanted to fixate on writing more. And this led him to taking a job in New Jersey to work in a track laying job. And according to David Leeming's biography and also James Baldwin's own writings and Notes of a Native Son, this was a really difficult year for him. His stepfather's health was failing. His father lost his job and at one point was found wandering around the 135th Lexington Avenue subway station. And so this was a difficult time. Baldwin struggled to do the work that he had to do at his job because he was small and the physical labor was difficult. Also, he was dealing with some of his first experiences with being up north and dealing with the much more overt and vitriolic Southern racism, being denied service at restaurants, not being allowed into certain neighborhoods, and being confused genuinely about this treatment. This is something that he writes about a lot, that he went to this one restaurant, I believe, called The Balt 3 different times, and he would wait to be served, and every time he wouldn't be served. Finally, I think the third time he was explicitly told, we don't serve your kind here. And this left a mark on him. He found it difficult to work this job and deal with the constant degradation. And he writes explicitly how this time made him understand his father's rage and abuse towards him and his siblings and the world growing up. Eventually, Baldwin would be fired from this job. His father would fall way more sick. He would return home June 1943, and he would find out that his mother was pregnant, which he considered his stepfather's mocking farewell present. And Baldwin started working another job in the city, trying to rear and support his family. It took him about a month to eventually visit his father at a mental hospital that he was being taken care of at in Long Island. And he visited with his aunt. And the writing of this moment is so beautiful and trying. He talks about his aunt crying and his father's throat whistling and how it was just so stirring because he avoided seeing his father because he says that he wanted to hate his father, not the ruin that his father had become. The ruin gave him mercy for his father. And the next day, his stepfather died. About a week or so later, his youngest sister would be born. And on the day of his 19th birthday, he would attend his father's funeral. And this whole section of James Baldwin's writing is so stirring. You get the sense of life and death clashing together. You get the sense of a larger, more structural kind of confrontation with what was happening, which was the fact that there was a race riot that had happened in Harlem the night before. So there was broken glass everywhere. He was falling apart, but for the sake of his family, he needed to hold it together. So he attends the funeral, he continues working, he struggles with drinking and finding any kind of romance or kind of meaning in the world, although he's working towards certain things. He begins to realize that maybe staying at home won't help his true goals towards being a writer. So eventually, with the advice of his friend Beaufort Delaney, he commits to moving to Greenwich Village. He gets a job at a famous restaurant bar called Calypso, where blacks and whites hang out alike. He meets Eugene Worth, and the rest is kind of history. Him and Eugene Worth become dear friends from 1943 to 1946. They're nearly lovers, according to James Baldwin's kind of mind, although Eugene Worth was straight. One thing that I found really, really interesting once you dig into these beginning parts with Eugene Worth is that there's this scene that I mentioned in an essay that I wrote where Eugene and James Baldwin are having food at a restaurant and Eugene starts crying and he says, James, you're a poet and you don't even believe in love. You're a writer and you don't believe in love. How can you write these things? There's something in this moment that I think can see birth later and later on. And the fact that James Baldwin is constantly trying to be a voice of reason and hope for other people, but on a deep underlying level, he kind of grasps his own cynicism, his own resentment, his own terror, his own kind of desire for revenge. And eventually, Eugene Worth unalived himself by jumping off the George Washington Bridge, similar to Rufus in another country. Baldwin's time in New York was coming to an end. He needed to leave to confront himself and to become the writer that he knew that he could be. And there's so much in this period of Baldwin's life that I think all of us can relate to, coming of age and feeling like certain things about your past or your background are a weight on you, wanting to be great, wanting to overcome these insecurities, the way that the world is trying to define and constantly define you, investing in people, believing in them, seeing them as a portal towards a better version of yourself that you could be, which I think Eugene Worth compelled James Baldwin to be. He was the only friend that was able to get James Baldwin ideologically aligned. And it was probably because he was into him. Like they became socialists. And God, it just breaks my heart to read about this section of Baldwin's life because I think it really shows that this cynicism that materializes throughout his rise is born from experience. And I think it's really moving to look at Baldwin's life as having started with so much tragedy and how literature and people gave him a sense that life mattered. And I think him leaving for Paris was another experiment towards this romanticism.
It's very different from the life that people imagine. And my involvements with men and with women, what can I say about them to the world? It's not to be talked about to the world. I loved a few men, I loved a few women. And a few people who loved me, that's, I suppose, that's all that saved my life.
In any case, I know, you see, something about my own experience. I know something about where I have been and what I have seen, what I know in my guts, in my blood. And I will never be able to deny, for any reason at all.
By now, Baldwin was saying that he was no longer interested in his work as a writer or his time in Paris.
I'll do a quick interlude here to talk about James Baldwin's life in Paris and to mention some of my own experiences, because I find the early chapters of James Baldwin's Paris life interesting. I find it interesting that he moved there with no money. I find it interesting that he lived in and out of hotels. I find it interesting that he was struggling to write his first book, Go Tell It on the Mountain. I found it interesting that he fell into a bunch of different lovers and situationships, that he got closer to Richard Wright. And when you really read parts of James Baldwin's books about these earlier years in Paris, there's a really notable moment where he is staying at a hotel. He allows his friend to stay at the hotel instead of him for like a couple of days. That friend steals a bed sheet. James Baldwin is then charged for stealing the bed sheet and then spends like 1 or 2 nights in jail over Christmas. His writing in this is so sad, so intense, so present. I've even had a moment in my life where I felt something like this. It was kind of random, but in 2016, I got detained, arrested. It's not the same thing as Baldwin by any means. I've had similar close situations in other countries, but when you read this moment, you can read some of the underlying fears that you sense that Baldwin has. There's a moment where he ends up in the courtroom where the judge reads off his charges, where people in the courtroom are laughing. He talks about how the laughter followed him. This moment is so sad because you realize that Baldwin realizes it's still possible to be humiliated in this very distinct carceral way, no matter where you are in the world. And I can only imagine the humiliation that he was working through, the confusion, the sadness, the inability to tell people back home what was really happening because his life probably seemed rosier. And you can see this thread all throughout his time. In Paris, James Baldwin stays there for a number of years. He publishes Go Tell It on the Mountain, and notably around the time that Little Rock desegregates their school and Ruby Bridges is photographed famously walking into the school. James Baldwin notes in various accounts that seeing this image in a newspaper and realizing that the struggle for civil rights, for Black autonomy, for Black liberation, for Black self-determination is still being waged in the US. Although his literary life is speeding up, other things in his life are speeding up, he understands that being in Paris, although it has saved him, it is not enough. He needs to go back and to join the movement, to be a part of fighting for his people. And that's what he does. Oh, yeah. And also in the Paris chapter, I have to mention the beef with Richard Wright. Hey, man, late do my go, bam, 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 bam. You think you're talking shit about me? I think I'm talking shit about you. Let's wait and see, because I can talk some shit about you. He had some beef with Richard Wright. If you haven't read into it, you should, because it's honestly kind of fucking sick.
Together, to struggle together, to go to jail together, to stand up for freedom together.
I had a buddy, 6 foot of man, muscled up perfect, game to the heart. They don't come by one.
But the white man got smart, and he turned a positive, what we thought was a positive, into a negative. And the worst thing we could have done over the past 20 years was the so-called integration. I really think it's the thing that got Martin killed. I think if Dr. King had continued integrating this, integrating that, integrating this, leading black folks, I think he'd be living today. But Martin was killed by those that make the decisions in this country, and he was killed because of his venture into economics. When he said, we're going to Washington, and Dr. King said, we're going to demand a redivision of the wealth. That's when they decided to kill him.
Martin's head was blown off. We learned something. And people say that this is now like the 60s. It's not like the 60s at all. Something else has happened. One sees it in survivors. In a sense, the white American knows it better than the black American. Yes.
11 Alive News. J.B. Stoner goes on trial tomorrow in Birmingham. Stoner, a native of Walker County, Georgia, has been a familiar figure in state politics for more than a decade. He's charged with conspiring to dynamite a black Baptist church nearly 22 years ago. No one was injured in the explosion, but it was one of 50 church bombings that rocked Birmingham in the 50s, and it gave it the nickname bombing.
I think it's a cycle.
I do.
No.
I agree.
I trust my ancestors. Because I know However this may sound, I know what happens to me when I'm in trouble. I know what my mother taught me, which was to love everybody.
Yep.
And when I'm in trouble, I listen to something. When I'm writing, I'm listening to something. Because, you know, all this bit about being a writer or being a star and all of that. The truth is, you become a writer because a day comes in your life, you have to accept it. You have to accept the fact that you're not a truck driver.
Yes.
You know,
even if you loved it.
No, that's your and I've done, you know, I ain't never driven a truck, but I can.
I felt like I would be remiss if I didn't sit down and talk about how James Baldwin has affected my life, how he's impacted me, how he's led me to travel, to be brave, to ask questions that are both similar and very different to the things that he worked through in his life. Around 2015, I graduated college. I moved to Seattle after a weird summer of working in Montana. I got a job as a labor organizer, got very burnt out with paid organizing, got fired, went through a depression or deep sadness through the winter, and it was remembering the James Baldwin speeches I listened to while I was scrubbing toilets and cleaning bathrooms and changing bed sheets. And I started researching James Baldwin again, I think around the new year of 2016. And I just got really inspired and I kept thinking, there's a queer Black writer whose legacy I admire. And what did he do to push himself to be a writer? He went to Paris. And so I booked a ticket. I talked to friends who had been there the year before. I basically talked to a friend and they were like, here's an address. I emailed these people. They're very secure. Go to this address. They know you're showing up. You'll have a place to stay. I flew to Paris. I remember when I landed, I got on the public transit train to leave the airport and I was so nervous that I missed my stop. And eventually I met my friend's friend from college. His name was Enzo. I got to meet other Americans, and there was this movement happening in France, and it was a labor movement called Nuit Debout. I had a big crush on the friend's friend whose house it was, Enzo, and I ended up going to my first riot and hooking up with him and going out to parties and stumbling through asking people words in French and selling beers at university parties. And for 3 weeks, I did my first solo trip, and it compelled me to keep traveling. Later on that year, I went to the Philippines. I went to South Korea. I spent most of my money. I five-finger discounted a bunch of the food that I ate. I got my heart broken by how people reacted to my Blackness. I also met so many kind, generous people. I almost fell in love with the boy there. After that, I kept going back to Europe as well because I ended up going back to France the next year and staying for 3 months. And those 3 months were amazing. And I remember I went because James Baldwin went to France when he was 24. And I remember thinking, I'm going to turn 24 this summer. I'm going to live in a circus. And I went. And I went to May Day, and I went to protests, and I traveled around, and I hitchhiked, and I went to the countryside, and I got to visit co-ops and really cool political spaces. And I just got to experience what it's like to be Black and out in the world and learning and curious and confused. And no one back home could really understand the experiences that I was having. No one, especially that I'd grown up with. And there's a part of Baldwin's loneliness and cynicism that I relate to in that way because my queerness compelled me to have to go out into the world because I had a family that didn't quite understand and I wanted people to be my God. Like I've been writing this essay and there's a line in that goes like, when the fable of family failed, I invested in the God that is in other people. And I think travel encapsulates that for me. I went to France for those 3 months and I traveled with friends and traveled with Enzo's friends and told him I loved him for the first time after he told me he loved me for the first time, and I fell in love. And I remember my birthday happened and I was so happy and I turned 24 and I felt like things can change. You can maybe go to grad school in France. Anything's possible. I was writing this book. And then I remember a few days after my birthday, I had a family member visit and we got drunk and they ended up we ended up talking about my family life and family stuff and me coming out. And eventually they let me know a family secret that I talk about in my book related to my father and his murder. And suddenly this magical, magical time of traveling around and hitchhiking and trying to learn French and, oh my gosh, I'm a writer and I'm traveling. It all came crashing down. The reality of my life, my queerness, my cultural background, all of the suffering I'd been through was tied to this secret that somehow would unleash all this other suffering. There's so much of Baldwin's reverence for his independence and his love for his community back home mixed with the suffering of what his country has done to him. And for me, some of that is what colonization and anti-buggery laws and homophobia has done to me and my family's process in assimilating to the US. Like, I view both of these processes as both being brought into a home and being brought into a violence. And I was really conflicted because I knew I would have to go home and ask a lot of questions and confront things that I've been wondering my entire life about my father and where I came from. And I remember the rest of my time being shaded by this sadness and also this gratitude for the fact that I was in this other part of the world trying to process something before I came back home. And I think it's why in my writing, I have a lot of imagery about heading towards a great experience of suffering and knowing that it's going to change you. And in your suffering and sadness and anticipation, almost wanting to honor it. And I went to Morocco. I worked at a hostel there. I kept thinking about my father and my mother and all the things that I'd gone through and how I felt like me coming out might not make my life fall apart, or it hadn't made my life fall apart. It was going to be this new thing, this new secret. And I went home and I talked to my family and I learned things I'd never known before. I learned things about my father and how he was murdered and the aftermath that really shook me to my core. And similar to Baldwin, it was writing that helped me process it. It was community that helped me process it. It was talking to friends. It was sitting down for hours at my computer, thinking about my life, thinking about the things I'd been through, honoring it, and grieving. Finding a way to fucking grieve is so central to the art making process. It is so central to the organizing process, to wanting a better world. If you don't know how to grieve, you don't know how to move forward. You don't know how to not let the past control you. And what if that past is personal? What if it's familial? What if it's emotional? What if it's systemic? How do you find your way out of the entanglement of what the world makes for you? And how do you make it into something that's for yourself? That is what travel taught me. That is what conscious travel taught me. It's what writing taught me. It's what Baldwin taught me. And I hope on some level, my videos and this channel and my work and my own writing, hopefully it can teach other people the same thing. But now, it's time to move forward and talk about James Baldwin's Years in Turkey.
I leave and I go back. I leave and I go back, and I try to work while I'm away. And in the last few years, I haven't. When in America, I've really done very little writing. I've scarcely even tried to because the pressures are too immediate and too great. And once one gets off the plane with the boat, one knows in 2 or 3 weeks it's going to be impossible to close one's door and to concentrate in the peculiar way you have to concentrate if you're really working. And that's just a fact, one of the facts of my life. I don't really know what to say about it. Very many people blame me when I'm in the States too. They don't think that they disapprove of my role, whatever my role is. But I don't know, I think all poets, and I'm a kind of poet, caught in this situation, which is a kind of pre-revolutionary situation, have a very difficult role to play. And insofar as they're real poets, they are committed to the welfare of the people, of all people, but they don't always read this welfare as simply as politicians might. My own effort is to try to bear witness to something which will have to be there when the storm is over. Help us get through the next storm. Storms are always coming. And that's a very individual effort which no one asked me to make it, so I have no complaints to make, about my treatment in the world. I asked for it.
So there is a really great book called James Baldwin, The Turkish Decade that I'm reading from. But this talks a lot about his drive to go to Turkey, the different things that happened there, the different kind of work that he was able to do. And we'll dig into this one particular section. And it reads, he loved being called Yam Yam. Okray Balamir, a translator and Baldwin's close friend in 1969 to 1970, told me in 2005 as he recalled their escapades to Club 20, a famous gay transgender hangout where Jimmy was a guest of honor. The nickname was mere loving banter and insider talk, Balamir said, because after a while he became one of us. In Istanbul, like race, Balamir also wanted me to understand Baldwin's erotic choice and lifestyle were not made a big deal of either. Jimmy's homosexuality was never apparent in Turkey. People looked up to him as an idol, as an intellectual. But sometimes Balamir chuckled, thinking of how little people in the street actually knew about African American culture and politics. They thought that he was a Black Panther. The chuckle referred also to Baldwin's fashion sense, which was a far cry from the required hypermasculine Panther garb of military vests, berets, and combat boots. Sadat Piquet told me about another instance of micro recognition that seemed both funny and slightly more plausible than others. Some people took Jimmy for the world famous Brazilian soccer star Pete, whom he shared such features as skin color, lithe frame, and expressive eyes. It seemed to his friends that such moments were amusing to Baldwin, much in the same way that being called a rap or yam yam was. They all confirmed that he loved the attention and awe he inspired, even among those who would hope to run into Black soccer stars rather than Black American writers in Turkey. I find this section interesting because it gets across the particularity of what traveling and being a Black American is like, the different ways that people have context for you, the different ways that that context is wrong, the different ways that the context is tied to a stereotype, the ways that you try to find humor or amusement in the cultural difference or shock of these other places. And there is always a line, like I've been traveling myself, where it feels totally ungrateful to complain about certain things that were really hurtful or confusing while you were traveling. Yet you also want to get across your gratitude for these spaces for largely allowing you to exist and to feel a bit differently. And what's interesting here is that in places in the world where other people have less than him or they're marginalized in a certain way, they haven't been exposed to Black culture, what whiteness compels and carries all around the world. And there is also the grace that I think is so key in what James Baldwin is willing to offer and the camaraderie he's able to offer to people by muddying the mask that he's wearing, by following these jokes, by reducing the overall impact of how structured these identities should feel. And I think that's a thread all throughout so much of what Baldwin is exploring and talking about and writing about, thinking about, but moving on. And so leading into the Malcolm X situation of it all, I covered this prominently in another video, but if you haven't checked that out, you should. It's titled How Hollywood Broke James Baldwin. But in another part of this book, The Turkish Decade, it reads, on September 15th, 1968, James Baldwin wrote that following several monumental fights with Hollywood, he walked off the Malcolm X project, which was a very unprofessional way to act, but necessary to convince the studio about doing things his way. He soon abandoned the project altogether, and along with his friends Gene and Wilford Delaney, made it back to Istanbul, as far away from Hollywood as it seemed possible to get. Baldwin's qualifications as a screenplay writer aside, it is significant that a Malcolm X film did not materialize until 1992, when Spike Lee reworked parts of James Baldwin's screenplay, One Day When I Was Lost, a scenario based on the autobiography of Malcolm X. Once you start reading into the Turkish decade, I will say there's parts of it where I'm kind of like, Baldwin, baby, what were you doing? And I will say this. I myself have traveled all over the world. I've had weird experiences. I've experiences that made me cry. I think the more healed part of me as an adult, as I think Baldwin writes in some things, has learned, fucking say that shit. If people were calling you the N word or staring at you or following you for blocks, and even if they're, what does Afropessimism say? They say that that fascination with blackness comes in negrophobia or negrophilia, like a fear of it or an obsession with it. Let that shit fly. It's weird, it's hurtful. And I'm not blaming Baldwin in any way because I do think a part of my fascination on my own literary level and a life level is how far can blackness take you? Where in the world will you end up? And there's also the question of if you have been rejected by your home country and you're searching for connection, love, feeling, humanism in other parts of the world, you will face some of the same terror and vitriol in those parts of the world as well. And I think this Turkey decade also reveals that as well. Because James Baldwin visited on and off, he went there to process, to cope. And this didn't mean that certain isms or problems didn't follow him. And I'm going to read a little bit more of this next section. Trigger warning, it does involve descriptions of some violence against James Baldwin. Leeming's biography also describes a disturbing incident during Baldwin's visit to the Anatoli village of Erdek that confirms it was not always possible to get away from the racism and homophobia in Turkey. By the time the magician came to town, Jimmy and our friend Hillary and I were well known to the villagers. The fisherman named Melret had become a protector, dropping by regularly to see that Arab Jimmy, literally Arab Jimmy, a term roughly equivalent to Black Jimmy, was doing well and enjoying the village. We had all seen the posters advertising Morgan, the magician hypnotist, who was to perform on a given night at the movie theater. The whole town would be there, and we were urged to go too. We laughed at Morgan's apparent confusion of Merlin with Morgan and Lefray. That is, our friend Hillary and I laughed. Jimmy did not. He suggested that the musician ought to have reasons for his sexually ambiguous stage name. We began to take Morgan more seriously. During that day, we heard reports that he had been seen eating a glass in the tea house. The villagers were wary of dark magic, and tension was rising as the time for the performance approached. 15 minutes after, Jimmy had casually told the boy from the news kiosk that he would like to meet this Morgan. The boy was cautiously leading the magician up the stairs to Jimmy's room. He was followed to the space before the room's balcony by a large number of other villagers out for the evening's promenade. When Jimmy, the musician, the fisherman, and I came out on the balcony, the situation resembled, in effect, a stage play. It all happened rather quickly. Morgan seemed to challenge Jimmy with his arrogance and apparent malevolence. He referred to the villagers as the shit on the street below us and boasted of his power over them. He had heard that Jimmy had the magic of words. He had the magic of mind. The villagers, hearing this conversation, became angry and threatening. Morgan laughed and offered to display his powers by putting me under enchantment. Mermet, the fisherman, was urging us to ask the magician to leave. Morgan was obviously a devil and not to be trusted. Still, we agreed to let him try to enchant me. Before long, watching his eyes as he mumbled something over me, I began to lose consciousness and my surroundings. Now Mehmet, who had been both frightened and angry, showed the magician away and out the door. The performance of the movie theater began predictably with a series of rabbit out of hat tricks, but turned ugly when Morgan hypnotized a man from the audience and, assisted by a scantily dressed woman and a surly man, stuck sharp objects in his hand, drawing blood and causing great pain to the victim. There were other hypnotic tricks, compromised villagers in various ways, usually through sexual innuendos, and the mood of the audience was not friendly by the time the curtain closed on the entertainment. Later that evening, Jimmy and I were having a drink on his balcony when the magician once again made an appearance. Morgan looked hard at me and suggested that I leave. Suddenly becoming extremely tired, I went off to the room without arguing, in spite of the fact that Jimmy presumably needed a translator, maybe some protection. It seemed to be impossible for me to resist the magician's suggestion. I have to pause here. What the? I read this and I'm like, would I end up in this situation in another country? You're in a village. All these people are looking at this magician like this is dark magic. James, you grew up in the church. I'm going to keep reading. The next morning, I went as usual to wake Jimmy for breakfast and found him on his bed, his face badly beaten. He explained haltingly it was difficult for him to talk. Morgan had made overtures, which Jimmy, in spite of a strong reluctance, had responded, and they had gone down the street to his hotel. As Jimmy had just had his cast removed, he was able to walk without a crutch, but with difficulty. In his host's room, he had been invited to get into the bed, which he did while the magician was occupied in what Jimmy thought was the bathroom. Once in bed, he was set upon by the magician and his male assistant, who castrated him and called him an N-word queer, and after beating him, left the room. Jimmy managed to put on some clothes and to crawl back to the deserted street to our hotel. Then he tried, without success, to shake me out of sleep and finally gave up and went to his own room when I found him in the morning. I read this, and not only is it horrific, it's sad, it's fucked up. I mean, getting beaten up by a magician in Istanbul. And I read this and it's just so sad. It's so sad. And then you read further around this time, his sister was apparently beaten up while in San Francisco. And it is very telling how James Baldwin deals with this. He essentially tells his sister, like, you can't let this hatred control you and you have to live your life and you do all these things to be successful. And seemingly, you can look at James's life as this constant struggle between his inclination towards depression, towards suicidal ideation, towards the darkness of his time and what was happening to his people, versus the fuel that his writing gave him, the fuel that his love for other people gave him, the fuel for argument, debate, discussion, connection, intimacy. And you can read it all throughout these various things. He goes into other parts of the world. He stays in places and gets to know the lady at the grocery store, the person at the cafe. This kind of drive, this motivation to move forward is so compelling, so inspiring. And I think it's why so many people revere Baldwin. The idea that a young black gay person would go out into the world and try to find things and to still face the ugliness of what it offers him back. I really relate to it. I mean, I've been in other parts of the world where entire high school crowds of people have surrounded me and demanded to take photos. I've been in other parts of the world where people will literally point at your face, point at your features, and laugh. Thankfully, I've never felt physically unsafe, but there's been many scenarios where you're kind of like, I'm floating around in the world, and if something happens, so be it. And this isn't like a, I don't care what happens to me. It's more of a, I'm willing to see how far things will go because I'm a human. I can take things there. And unfortunately, I think this situation shows that no matter where you go, evil, treachery, all of these isms still have the potential to follow you. He would begin to engage with the Black Power struggle movement of the US. In this section, he wrote, what he could gather of a power struggle at SNCC was confusing. He liked John Lewis and John Foreman, but he liked Stokely Carmichael. He was wary, however, of what he feared was a turn towards separatism and an ideology centered on a misguided idea of Black power. To David, he wrote that he would resist getting caught up in some mystical Black bullshit. That was why the nightmare had begun in the first place. He thought it would be best to finish the novel quickly and then return to help organize concrete acts, demonstrations, boycotts, strikes to reduce the establishment's economic power. He was not willing to embrace communism and any other ideology, but he argued that the economic system of the West would have to be modified. Once you dig more into James Baldwin, you figure out that he is politicized, but he's not explicitly politicized in the sense that other more movement heavy folks are. See this conflict in some of the reading that you do when he goes back to the US and he attends meetings and becomes an advocate and a spokesperson. He says consistently throughout interviews and other things that he is not an organizer, an activist. He is an artist that's willing to speak towards what is happening in the times. I think something that Baldwin writes about a lot is that there's no guaranteed safety, although we deserve to be treated well. And I think the Malcolm X assassination being the first of many assassinations. So, in the documentary Meeting the Man, which is a series of European filmmakers traveling to Paris to interview James over the course of a number of days, I watched this documentary for the first time a number of years ago. And what really shook me about it was the immense tension in this film. This film was made around the time that these assassinations had just happened. Notably, while he was writing this Malcolm X script, it was when he learned that Martin Luther King Jr. was killed. This was why he couldn't finish the Malcolm X script. It was why he had to go to Turkey. It was why he was running in a different way during this period of time in his life. And in Meeting the Man, I was so shook when I first watched it because there are moments throughout James Baldwin's career where you can see his break with the more romantic and hopeful and hope offering James Baldwin. And in Meeting the Man, you can really see the version of James, that fun loving James that felt like you were family, and the version of James that really loved all kinds of people and was endeared by them and trusted them and wanted to revere people that did right by him. There's the James that used a lot of people, show up late to things, wanted to be paid early, left jobs early, was a bit unreliable. I wonder what the late 60s did to him. I wonder what being called Martin Luther Queenie by Eldridge Cleaver did to him. I wonder what seeing his friends like Bard Rustin being ousted out of the Southern Christian Leadership Conference did to him. I wonder what the vitriol he received at the hands of other writers and thinkers did to him, how some people called his work overly flowery, how he didn't have as much relevance in the Black American movement, how he didn't speak to Black issues, how interviews, especially Meeting the Man, tried to nudge him.
I mean, there is a significance to this monument, which I've asked you about. Now, I've been challenged, I've been criticized, and I've been told that I didn't ask the question the right way. So how should I have asked it? It's an honest question.
Terry, I know what is happening here.
What? Tell us what's happening.
What is happening is that he has something in his mind, and I have something in my mind too, which you don't quite see. And now you're doing something really, rather against your will, without quite knowing what it is. Look, I am not interested in Jimmy Baldwin's Paris.
Right.
I'm not in the least interested in my 22 years in this city. It's of no importance at all.
Right.
What is important is I'm a survivor of something and a witness to something. That is what matters.
Right.
And that is all that matters. I'm not speaking for me. I'm much too proud, for one thing, to speak for my own work. My work will speak for itself or it won't. But I am a black man in the middle of this century. And I speak for that to all of you, the English, the French, the Irish, all of you. Because none of you know yet who this dark stranger is. None of you know it. And that is what this quarrel is really about. I'm not at all what you think I am. I'm very different than that. I have something else to do.
And there's also another beautiful moment where he's sitting down around a bunch of Black folks, and there's younger Black folks that are giving him praise and giving him his flowers. And he talks about how he would rather be anything but white. And then at the end of this film, there is a really beautiful section where the interviewer is trying to push him. The interviewers ask him, like, but like white people read your books, and like, who are your books really for? And do you write for people? Do you write for all people?
You do spend a long time between novels. Why is that?
Well, I'm that kind of writer. There's no answer to that. Some people write, I wish I was George Simenon. People write them in 2 weeks, but I can't. And everybody works the way he can work. I must point out, though, too, that I've been working in the last few years between assassinations. That doesn't make it any easier either. I mean, they're killing my friends. It's as simple as that. And have been all the years that I've been alive. For no reasons which have any validity.
Why don't you just want to get away somewhere and sit down and write your books? Why don't you want to do that?
Because I'm better than that.
But you don't have to be better than that.
No, I do.
So you don't agree then? I mean, when people say, oh, it's okay for him, he's escaped.
What have I escaped? Where, anyway, would I go to escape? To your country? Would I get a political asylum here? Where would a fleeing black man go if he wanted to escape?
There's such honesty in his eyes. There's such a clear sense of presence. There's such a clear sense of hurt. I look at so much at the Baldwin of the late 60s, and I see his romanticism falling away. I see his willingness to comfort certain kinds of people falling away. And I see his rage at white liberalism, at white centrism, at the people that wanted to engage in these movements to feel like a better person for the time being, but couldn't really do the heavy work of carrying this boulder, which is the American project, which is American exceptionalism, to the top of the mountaintop, as Martin Luther King would have imagined or experienced. And I really do feel like Meeting the Man is kind of James Baldwin's departure with this sort of willingness to speak to this greater, more beautiful, more equal America. Like, he still does it throughout his later years, but I think his willingness to do it is much more scrubbed away. because he considers himself a part of the wreckage and the aftermath of the civil rights movement. He considers what the Black Panther Party and the Black Power movement to be doing later on to be really generative and powerful, if not without some level of critique in terms of the racial centrism that it offers. But I do think you can see in his later years that James Baldwin is really reaching towards, how can I be a writer that's legible towards my people? How can I be a writer that can say things in a way that my people want to hear? And not to say that he didn't do that before, but I think now he's much more concerned with that being a function of his work. I really do think when you look at all these different parts of James Baldwin's life, what still scares America about him today, what his work compels people to do, is to grieve. Whether it's him going to Paris at the age of 24, trying to grieve Eugene Worth's death, the possibility of this beautiful queer platonic or romantic future, whether it be him fleeing to Turkey after the failed Malcolm X script and the assassination of MLK, of needing time and space away to grieve, of not wanting to see people that you know, of wanting to feel like a stranger in another village, the stranger in the village, as his essay and collection explores, and in meeting the man, the grief of a decade where he put so much into the world and his country and his people, where he went to rallies and demonstrations, where he had people talk about him sideways, and to still have your friends and these leaders killed. And I look at the America of today, and I've been writing essays recently, and it's so powerful in a sense to revisit Baldwin, to think about him again, because I look at the America today and I see how we haven't been able to grieve in a variety of ways. Has America really grieved the horrors of our obsession with gun violence? Has Black America ever truly been able to grieve the transition from chattel slavery to segregation to modern carcerality as we know it? All of the bodies that have been disappeared, all of the people that have been maimed, disfigured, injured, humiliated, killed on camera, the ways that capitalism, corporations are destroying the environment and destroying parts of Central America. Has white America grieved all of the isms and colonization and imperialistic violence that it's spread all around the world? Is Trump 1.0 and 2.0 a symptom of our inability to grieve, or a symptom of our inability to confront the ways that white supremacy and colonization has done wrong? And our entire educational system has been built on fucking ignoring that shit. And now we live in the internet age. You don't need to grieve because you can constantly escape. You can watch something. You can watch something while you're watching something else. You can have AI give you the argument for you. What kind of future are we embarking on? What kind of future are we embarking on? And I think if we were to embody James Baldwin's rage and dismay and the grace that he could offer people at times, I think it's a blueprint among many blueprints of how we can move forward. And for me, grieving has looked like organizing, like having community that I can go to and talk to. Like when I'm angry, figuring out what soothes me, figuring out who I can trust, figuring out the ways I can act politically that allow me to release this anger. And I'm by no means any perfect. I don't have it all figured out, but I view writing as a form of grieving. I've been at this residency thinking about my first book, writing through these newer essays, a part of some of my grief with the world as a Black queer body, just like James Baldwin was a Black queer body, is wanting to answer seemingly impossible emotional and existential questions. What does it mean to lose things and to expect to lose things, but to want to offer up so much of yourself to the world? Who loved gay Black boys before this certain form of media? Can we ever be more than what white supremacy has done to us? What does it truly mean to escape? And is it ever really possible? And according to Baldwin, you can't. You bring home with you. You carry the scars and the evils and the assumptions of whatever systems you were born into and whatever love helped you survive that system. And hopefully you go out into the world and you learn some new things so you can change some of those lessons. You can orient yourself a little bit more lovingly and beautifully to the people around you. And ideally, you have the capacity for self-defense, for self-determination. And I think this is some of where I deviate from Baldwin. I do believe that art and literature and self-expression has the power to change the world around us. Being ardently involved in political organizing, the ability to name an ideological framework gives us a lot of power, gives us a lot of legibility, gives us a lot of materiality in ways that I think Baldwin's work towards racializing himself in his later years was also attempting to do. Thank you for watching another video on this channel. I definitely want to do more of Baldwin videos as I've been embarking on writing more essays and digging more into his life and rereading his works. One of my goals for the latter half of this residency is to read more Baldwin, so expect more videos on this channel. And if you want to support this channel, check out my Patreon, become a channel member, hit the subscribe button, click to be notified when videos come out because that helps boost this channel in the algorithm. And if you enjoyed this, please comment. Let me know if you learned something new about James Baldwin, if you knew about his Turkey years, if you knew about any of the pieces of media that I mentioned in this. If you haven't checked out Meeting the Man, you should. I believe it's on YouTube, and I'll link in the description. But till next time, read some Baldwin. Wow. I love filming outside. Like, look at this. Oh, look at this resident. Also, it's like, if I hadn't loved Baldwin, I wouldn't be here at this residency in the way that I am. Like, this is fucking beautiful. Look at this thumbnail. Okay, for the vlog, this is me for the vlog. Use this clip in the vlog. It's after dinner. I sometimes feel very, very fucking overstimulated.
There may not be, as much humanity in the world as one would like to see, but there is some. There's more than one would think. In any case, if you break faith with what you know, that's a betrayal of many, 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 many people. I may know 6 people, but that's enough. Love has never been a popular movement, and no one's ever wanted really to be free. The world is held together, really it is held together, by the love and the passion of very few people.